I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker today, Dr. Christina Limbert from Linden Global. And so just wanted to tell you a little bit about her. So obviously she's going to be doing a great webinar for us today, but also wanted to look forward to on the 2nd of May, where they're going to be doing another webinar on competence and cultural humility. And so we put on some webinars through ECIS, and we're a part of the Inclusive Education Special Interest Group. So this is me and Eleni, who's in Frankfurt, and we have two other team members, Martha Ross and Amy Lino. And so we try to do a monthly webinar focused around student support or learning support or inclusion. But today we have our guest from Linden Global, and Linden Global and Christina actually visited our school a few years ago when we were doing a job alike for learning support, and we were really having a difficult time finding speech therapists, occupational therapists, educational psychologists that could do reports in different languages. And so she came and did a nice presentation for all of us for our schools here in Vienna. And it's just been such a great collaboration ever since. And Linden Global also offers different professional development opportunities that some of our teachers have been a part of, like their SEN circles and consultation groups. And that's been a really had a great impact on our school. So I just wanted to thank you, Christina, and pass it over to you.
Well, thank you, Chad. Yeah, I need to come back to Vienna. It'll be great to see you all again, and Martha too. And thanks especially to Eleni, who started this conversation, and we discussed like what Linden could offer and what kind of ideas we could share with your group. And I'm really so excited this has come to life. So as Chad said, my name is Tina, Dr. Christina Limbert, and I'm an educational psychologist. Here you see my co-founder, Chi Ugbor, who's a TCK who went to VIS, Vienna International School. And the reason we started Linden is because as a head of student support services at an international school in Germany, I was constantly banging my head against the wall trying to find good, strong referral sources for EdPsych reports, for speech, OT, counseling, all those things that we couldn't offer enough of in the school. And I was always going to my director being like, we need to hire somebody, we need to hire more people. And he'd just say to me, Tina, it's a bottomless barrel. You're never, ever, ever going to have enough support. So just grabbed Chi, my favorite school counselor, and off we went. We're like, let's create the referral source that we wish we had. Like, what do we wish we had? We wish we had like multilingual, super competent, really kind and excellent specialists that we could refer our students to. And just like Chad said, like consultation circles and really great professional development. So it just made what I wish that I had had. And so today, our focus is going to be on the EdPsych assessment component. And that's really, of all of what we do at Linden, that's the thing I'm definitely the most comfortable in. And that's what I spend most of my time talking about. When Chi and I started Linden, it was just me doing all the EdPsych reports. And now today, that was about 9 years ago, there are 25 EdPsychs in our project, posted all over the world. And they speak a lot of different languages. We can work in 6 different languages, meaning we can do EdPsych assessments bilingually in a bunch of different ways. So just something I'm proud of and spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about. And it's something that's really important to me because there's a lot of not excellent reports out there that float around with the students. And I think it's really important that we have conversations around what a great report looks like, how do we know when a report is a good reflection of a child's abilities. So that's why I'm here today. And I would love to hear from you what you would like to learn. You guys are all experts in inclusion and learning support. A lot of you are qualified in doing the academic assessment part of EdPsych reports. So I know that we have a lot of experts here in the room, and I would love to hear from you. Let me see how I can see your faces and see. Yeah, could you write in the chat what it is you hope to learn today? Any questions or topics that are especially interesting? Then I can know sort of where to park myself during the presentation, or which things maybe to skip over that you're already experts in. What would you like to learn about EdPsych assessments today? About exam accommodations. Okay, I didn't actually have a section on that, so I will be sure to talk about that. What else? I don't want to be too basic or too advanced, so. Okay, well, I'll slowly start going through what I plan to discuss, how to read a report, great. We'll definitely do that. Which parts are most valuable for teachers? Really good question, Anna. Yes, we will talk about that. What should a report include? Yes, we've got that. Definitely. How to explain to students. Ooh, so good. I did not put that in. Okay, I'll make sure that we touch on that. Great point, Florencia. Okay. Good. Okay. Well, that gives me a bit of an idea of where you are, where you guys are at. If you have any other ideas, I won't always be able to see the chat, so maybe Chad or Eleni, if someone's writing in the chat, if you could just jump in. Oh, and I forgot to mention that today we are, of course, talking about EdPsych reports, and there may be some questions or comments that you have that would require confidentiality. So please keep that in mind when you're asking questions, not to identify your students. Sometimes it's important not even to identify your school if you have a really critical case. So keep confidentiality in mind today. And I don't see anyone with difficulties muting your microphones or your cameras, but please keep that in mind as well. Okay, Karina also asked how to apply school psych reports to the classroom. Great. Diagnostic information when further assessments are needed. Okay, those are great questions, Claire. When further assessment needed and applicability. Okay. When I look at a graph, I don't always understand what I'm looking at. Yes, yes, I hope that we touch on that. Okay, oh, so much exciting stuff. I'm such a nerd when it comes to this topic, so yay for me. Okay, so what I plan to discuss today, which I think hits most of your questions, is the what, when, why, and who behind EdPsych assessments. We're going to look at what the 8 building blocks are of a report and some basic statistics. We're going to look at some of the most common tests and what they measure. Something that I'm very passionate about is looking at the multicultural considerations in an assessment. We're going to talk about the red flags in reports, when to know, like, ooh, this is something that I need to really be careful with, and my own special foolproof steps on how to read a report that I use myself. Because some of those puppies are long, 42 pages. Oh my gosh, who has time for that? Me. Okay, so like I said, if you want to unmute yourself and just jump in, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, write any questions in the chat, and I have hopefully planned enough time for questions at the end as well. So just so we're all clear what the definition is, an EdPsych report is a detailed report that is written after a one-on-one assessment, including information about cognitive, academic, social, emotional functioning of a child, and providing recommendations for a student's success at school and home. Many of you probably can also already think of a report that you've gotten that didn't include all of those, or maybe only a couple of those. So we're looking at one-on-one. It should have multiple components of a child's functioning, not necessarily all of these, but it should have a combination, and it should be providing recommendations. Who can conduct an EdPsych evaluation? When it comes to the cognitive and emotional testing, really these reports should only be coming from psychologists, ed and school psychs, educational and school psychologists. It's different terminology in different countries. Neuropsychologists, psychiatrists. There are diagnosticians and psychometricians who would be doing parts of tests, but they shouldn't normally be issuing an entire report. And as you all know, many of you are qualified to do, are certified to do academic testing. That can always be woven in as a component of an EdPsych assessment. But really, we are looking at these 4 groups of specialists who are qualified to do the assessments. Every once in a while, a parent will say, oh, I have a psychoeducational assessment for you. And you're reading it and you find out it was done by a speech therapist or an OT. That doesn't mean it's bad or wrong. It just means that they probably don't have the full picture. So this is, I think, important to keep in mind. This is important to me. When should an EdPsych assessment be conducted? I have a feeling in some of your schools, you may have teachers who run into a snag with a student and they are very quick to say, well, test them. We should get them tested. So I think that there's, in my perspective, my professional opinion, there's only really 3 reasons why you're going to want to get a student assessed. Mostly, number one is all alternate internal screenings and interventions within your team have been exhausted, and the student is just not responding to their interventions as you would expect. You've done everything you can, you're stuck, okay? They're still lagging behind, they're not catching up like you would expect. We don't jump, like assessments are a tier 3 kind of intervention or kind of step that we're going to do. And we don't want to jump to that too quick. It's costly, it's time consuming, it's overdoing it in many cases. So it's only really when we've exhausted all other things within the school. Number 2, student has been previously assessed, but their assessment is more than 3 years old. Most assessments are valid for 3 years, after which they're going to need an update. However, if your students at school, it's been 3 years and they're thriving, they're doing well, they're going to graduate with you, you have your intervention, you don't need to redo it in 3 years if everything's going well. Unless, reason number 3, that child's about to move. If they're about to move to a new school, you would probably want to get that eval redone so that when they hit the ground in their new location, that school kind of has a user manual for how they can support that student and not waste a lot of time figuring it out on their own, or maybe referring back to an old assessment that's no longer really a good reflection of that student. Oh, I see we have a couple comments. Okay, John has some questions in here. You might need to remind me of some of these, John. These are really good questions. And Tamara pointed out that there are specialist teachers who are qualified to do the cognitive portion as of the evaluation as well as the academic. That's true. There are definitely cultural differences from country to country. And there is a qualification in the UK for cognitive testing that you can get, but usually that person will have other further degrees that kind of round out that certification, that they only have the cognitive part. But that's a really good point. Thank you for saying that. And there are always going to be cultural differences. We need to be open-minded to that. So those are the 3 reasons why I think when I think it's the right time for an EdPsych assessment. Now, again, cultural differences. Many of your students are going to be coming in with reports from all over the world, and there will be variation in this. But in essence, you're going to be looking for these 8 building blocks of a report. Number 1, a referral question, then the measures that they use, that's the test they use, background information, interviews with people around the child, observations, results, a summary, and recommendations. Again, you've probably seen reports that don't have all of these components, but if you're looking at a really good report, it should have these 8 components. I'll be touching on this multiple times today, but if you're doing EdPsych assessment with a student, a monocultural student, living in their same country where they've always been. I live in Berlin, so if there was a German student who'd been living in Germany their whole life, some of these components are not as important as they are for our students in international schools. The background information is going to be pretty much the same unless there was a medical emergency. You're not going to need as much kind of 360-degree input because they're a pretty standard student in a pretty standard setting. With our students, we have to be a lot more careful, and I'll talk more later about why. So just like we teach our kids in the 2nd grade when they start doing their first science experiments, you have to have a research question. We need to know, what are we looking for? Some psychologists and some schools will just be like, oh, just throw the whole kitchen sink at them. Let's just do all the tests and we'll find something. We'll look for something. That's not really the right way to do it. This shouldn't be just a general fishing expedition with a great big net. We should really be looking at, what are we specifically trying to learn with this process? Once again, it's time consuming for the child. They're coming out of class. It's expensive. The report just gets longer and longer if we do every test. I kind of think of it like like a recipe. The referral question is sort of like my recipe. I'm like, I want to make lasagna. Okay, so I know that that's lasagna, and then I have to look at what ingredients am I going to pick to put in the lasagna. I'm not going to put in strawberries. I'm not going to be putting in whipped cream. Hopefully not. You know, my referral question is going to help me narrow down what am I specifically looking for, and that referral question should be pretty close to the top. Like, what are we really trying to learn? For example, does Leo's academic and cognitive profile suggest that he has particular difficulties in math? If so, why? And how can we help? Or based on Fatima's individual strengths, weaknesses, and her language background, what can be done to support her literacy development? Okay, so I'll come back to this also, but in the summary of the report, they should always go back to the referral question. What were we trying to answer? And then answer that question. The next part of the report is where they list their instruments. And like I said, this is kind of the ingredients of the recipe. Like, okay, I'm going to need tomatoes and noodles or whatever. So depending on what the referral question is, so what was Leo's question? Leo's question, it depends a bit how old he is, but if we're looking for difficulties in math, then we are probably going to want to do some cognitive measures, some academic measures. We may not need social emotional measures for Leo. If he's a high functioning 10th grader with great social skills, we may not need social emotional measures or behavior and attention things. We may not. But at Linden, we have in our test bank probably about 80 different measures that fall into these, usually into these 4 categories. We also have speech measures and occupational therapy measures, but for the most part, all of our tests fit into these 4 categories. But these are the instruments that you're going to see the most often on your assessments. You're going to see the WIPSI, which is a cognitive, meaning an IQ test for little kids, for preschool kids. It's really fun to administer. If you ever want to learn about it, you can ask me, have a separate meeting. The WISC is the most common cognitive test you see for children. It usually goes from around age 6 or 7 to age 16. The WACE is the cognitive test used for kids above 16. And another one they use is the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive. This is, a lot of psychs don't like it because it's pretty American. Most of these tests, especially the WISC, has been translated into many languages. So you may be getting a version of the WISC that's been standardized for Spanish or French or German or probably the Chinese. I haven't checked recently, but this is the really common test that you're going to see. Then we have the academic measures. These are, oh, once again, back to the cognitive measures. Usually that's going to include something with memory, something with processing speed, a verbal component, so verbal intelligence, fluid reasoning, which means problem solving, and then something analytical. Okay, those are usually around the 5 components that are in the cognitive measures. In the academic measures, we have your just basic reading, writing, spelling. Sometimes you'll have cognitive fluency. How quickly can they respond to academic questions? Then we have social emotional measures. The most common one that's used is the BASC. It's the Behavior and Assessment Scale for Children. That covers about 15 different aspects of a child's behavior and emotions. Then we have attention and neuropsych tests, the most common ones being the Vineland, the NEPSI, the TEACH, and the Connors. All of those, except for the TEACH, are questionnaires. So it's really hard to get, and the BASC also, it's really hard to collect like social and emotional and attention kind of data directly from kids. And so unfortunately, we have to use questionnaires, surveys from parents, teachers, and the child. The TEACH is a direct attention measure where we're really doing a whole bunch of, well, the TEACH and the NEPSI actually are measures where we're asking specific questions and learning about their attention. But a lot of these in this area are going to be questionnaires. Do we have any questions on this so far? I could talk, there's a billion assessment instruments, but okay. Experience, it's like evaluate. Oh, yes. Varies on the child's profile, yeah. Tier 2 support when the girls are not white because prototypical research. Yes, there's over-identification of children, especially in the United States. Children of color are more likely to be referred for assessments. Do you use Naegeli test? We do not use that test. I'm not familiar with it. And of course, all these tests have a certain level of bias, and I'll talk about that also. It's a really good point. Do you think it's important for the assessor to observe the student in class? It is great when the assessor can observe the student in class, and I'll get to that in a second. Again, that's going to come back to the referral question for, was it Leo, who maybe a 10th grader with no behavior issues, who we think just maybe has a math disability or math difficulty? A classroom observation, less important. If we're talking about a 2nd grader with ADHD types of concerns or maybe aggression, a classroom observation would be really important if possible. Yeah. Okay, let me talk for a second about bias in instruments, and I'll get to this also when we talk about the statistics. In the international school population, there are no tests that are developed for our population. So all of these tests are going to be developed and normed for their cultural context. That means even if this test was biased in its home country, it's going to be extra biased or extra invalid for our populations. That's why in the international context, these specific cognitive measures or these specific standardized measures really can only be a component, like one of 8 components of your assessment. It cannot, if in a monocultural situation, like John mentioned, if we were like a middle class white 7-year-old, you can place more weight on some of these standardized measures. Any kid who has a more diverse background, these measures become less and less accurate. So I'll talk more specifically about this, but there's bias in everyone and there's bias in every measure. And that's why we use it as one piece of the puzzle, but not the whole puzzle, if that makes sense. That's why in the international context, I'm going to be putting a lot of emphasis into the background information. We want to look at this child as a whole person. And like you said, we'll get to the observations in a second as well. We want to be collecting information from as many different perspectives as we can. So in the background section of a good report, we're going to be seeing what languages are spoken in the home. Where has the child lived? How many different schools have they attended? And which languages were used in these schools? Sometimes you assume one thing about a child, but once you start digging back into their language background, you find that, oh, this child has been exposed to 6 different languages before the age of 5. I didn't realize that he had a Farsi-speaking nanny while he was living in Kazakhstan. Wow, that's a really important piece of the puzzle. So this background information is crucial in an international context. Then the background information will also tell us unusual points in their medical or health history, their birth history, developmental history. Sometimes this is really important, sometimes it's less important. If we're looking at exam accommodations for a 10th grader, again, it's not as important how long the mother's pregnancy was. When we're looking at a 3 or 4-year-old, these components are much more important. So once again, thinking about, are we making lasagna? Are we making cheesecake? What are we looking for? What instruments are really, and which components are the most important based on the referral question? So with my team, whenever they're stuck, I'm like, okay, let's go back to the referral question. What are we trying to answer? And how important will these points be? But anytime we're looking at like attention, language, literacy, like these questions about languages and languages spoken at schools are so important. Also, the background should be talking about what previous interventions or assessments the child has already received. Now, again, we're trying to get as many pieces of the puzzle as possible. I'm going to want to have interviews in a really good report, and not just a parent and a teacher, but ideally I want to hear student voice. Like even really little kids, you could ask them, what's your favorite part of school? What's something that you really wish you could learn, but you haven't figured out yet? Or one of my favorite questions is I explained to the students that This report is going to go to your teacher. So what would you like your teacher to know? Or if you're moving next year, what would you really like your new teachers to know about you? And I tried to reflect that in the kids' report. So again, as many pieces as possible, downplaying the standardized score a little bit and upplaying all these different perspectives. And along with that comes the observations too, depending on referral question, but ideally we'll have a classroom observation, a playground or a cafeteria, like a less structured environment observation, and then observations within the testing session. A lot of times you'll get a report and the child has had no problems in the testing session, right? And the psychologist will be like, well, they're fine. I don't know what you're talking about. But that's a one-on-one in a quiet room, right? So if the referral question has anything to do with behavior or attention, it's important that you have the observations from other settings as well. Questions or thoughts on that so far? So we're up to 5 components of a report, 5 of the 8. Now comes the results. Yes.
Can I ask you, sorry,
Anything.
do you conduct also risk assessments if the student is in a danger to himself, themselves, or to others? Do you have those components? How do you approach this?
Yes, thank you. Good question. Yes, we do risk assessments. Those are definitely a very, very specific referral question. And we'll be doing, and if we think about the different types of instruments that we'd use, we'd be using questionnaire data and interviews for that. I would not be doing cognitive testing usually. But I remember very specifically getting a report. There was a student I was really concerned about depression, and I had outsourced them to a psychologist who I actually really liked. And she sent me back a report where she'd done IQ testing with him, and there was really no reason. He was an absolute fine student. But anyway, yes, we do risk assessments. Those are very specific. And with all Linden work, with all Linden work, we're going to be doing those very tightly in conjunction with the school, getting feedback from the school as well. Yeah. Okay, so statistics, the results. Again, these instruments are using norm reference standardized tests, which means let's take the WISC, the most common cognitive test of all times. They've gone out, they made their, 100 questions, right? And they asked 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 kids in that country or in that cultural context, all those questions, and tried to figure out what's normal. So then when we measure our student, their score is going to tell us, did they perform better or worse than the average of a kid who's the same age or grade and gender as that child? So specifically, standardized tests were made to place students' scores on a bell curve, knowing that most individuals would be performing here in about, so 68% of individuals would be performing in this level. There's the 1 standard deviation below, 1 standard deviation above. Then anyone who's in like this 15-ish%, then we know, okay, they're performing below average. And this is where we need to start looking, or they're performing above average. And we need to start looking at what's going on there and how can we help. Now, as I've mentioned, these tests are being normed in specific countries. There's no tests that are normed for all of international school students. So we're going to make our own standardization sample here. I'm going to put the link. Can I do that? I'm going to put the link in the chat. If I can here. One moment. Oh, can you guys see this survey? Yes, okay. So I'm going to copy the response link and put it in the chat. Okay. And we're going to build our own internationally normed measure here. Let's see. Too many screens open. How do I make that go? Okay, activate. So how do we feel today? So far, we know 50% of international school teachers, inclusion educators, are dazed and confused. Okay. This is cool. I didn't see what our sample size was. That's important to know. Okay. Hmm. I really should have looked at how many people are filling this out, but all right. So it looks like we're going to pretend that this is a sample of 1,000 international school educators. All right. So now that I have these questions standardized, let's say, I will know that I'm going to expect most educators to be either really happy or confused. And that we're going to expect some to be specifically joyful, and about 17%, I'm going to expect around 17% of my educators to be contemplative. Now, I know that it will be highly unusual for me to have a teacher who feels like a skull and crossbones or feels like death on a Friday afternoon. I'm also going to know it's be highly unusual for someone to feel like a clown, or I never exactly know what this is, but I think it's cute, like foggy, I guess. So when I next week give this measure to 1,000 other teachers, then I have an idea already what's normal. And that's what we're doing with the kids in our standardized testing, okay? Except for our tests are not using an international sample. They're just using monocultural samples, which is why we have to be so careful. Let's try another one. Can you see the second one? How often do you in your job need to read a psychoeducational report? Is it working?
Christina, can you share for this one as the one before, because we can't see? Yeah.
Oh, let's try now. Now. There we go. Is it working now? No? There we go. Okay. Once a month. Okay. So once again, I would then, yeah, that also helps me understand how much you guys are doing this. But this gives me an idea of what I could expect from international school educators. Okay. All right, we'll try another one. Okay. How comfortable do you feel interpreting psychoeducational reports? Oh no, not one of these. Which side is up? Okay, if I must, but I don't know what I'm doing. It's interesting, even if I don't get all of it. Awesome. I could write one myself. I like the honesty. Thank you. Cool. Okay. In the interest of time, we'll just do this last one because this one helps us understand means a little bit better, means and averages. So this one is a little bit more important because the others were more like questionnaire data. And this is more like something that we could actually measure and find an average to. So how long have you been working in international schools? Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is probably going to be pretty good bell curve. Okay, so imagine this being a bell curve with 1 year being we have very few people who are only been, or 0% who've been educators for 1 year, and then boom, and then 0% who, or only 1 or 1%, well, okay, it's 25%, but just a few who've been educators for more than 20 years, okay? So I'm going to come back to this example when we're looking at the statistics in a second. All right, thanks for playing along. Okay. Can you see my slides again? Yes. Can't see you guys. Okay, great. Okay, so let's think about years of teaching, right? We had one person who's up here for 20 years, let's say, and 0 people who were down here who'd only been teaching for 1 to 3 years, whereas most of you guys were in the expected range, like 7 to 10 years of teaching, let's say. So that means that any kid who's falling in this range, like between what we call the 25th and the 75th percentile, we're not going to be too worried about them. That's not going to be of concern for us. It's what we call between 1 standard deviation above or below what's the total exact average, okay? Then if we get 2 standard deviations below, that's where we start to be like, okay, this is 1 standard deviation below, 2 standard deviations below, that's where we really start to get concerned. We're talking about kids that are in the 2nd or the 3rd percentile. So our educator here in the room who had been teaching for 25 years, we're going to say they're probably like in the 90th percentile for educators. That means if they're the 90th percentile, then they've been teaching longer than 90% of educators. If we had someone who'd only been teaching for 1 year, they'd probably be in the 1st percentile because they've only been teaching longer than 1%. So you're going to see percentile or percentile rank very often in the reports. And percentile gets really confusing for people because they think it means percentage. So if they see like an IQ test and somebody says, okay, they were in the 10th percentile for this, it doesn't mean they got 10% of the items correct. It means they were better than 10% of their peers. I see some things in the chat. Oh yeah, good, okay. Just so you guys can see me, all right? So percentile is an important thing to keep in mind. Standard deviation just means how far away are you from the norm. I know you guys all learned this in college, but I still have to remind myself, and I do this all the time. So within these bell curves, there's 3 types of scores you're going to see the most often. There's like actually 15 of these different types of scores, but the ones you're going to see the most often in your reports is a standard score. That is going to vary with the test, but generally a standard score is going to have between 90 and 110, sometimes 85 to 115. Here, this picture here is 85 to 115 is considered average. So we're not going to worry, we're not going to be too concerned or overinterpret any student who has scores between 90 to 110 or 85 to 115, depending on the test. So most IQ tests use the standard score. Then a score you're going to see a lot in the reports is a scaled score. And those, the average range, so here, our average range is going to be about 8 to 12. So we won't be concerned about anything that's in the 8 to 12 range. You'll see the scaled scores a lot, like in a subtest of an IQ test. So, for example, the famous block design, you know, the one where they have the little red and white blocks and they have to like build different patterns. When a psychologist is reporting their block design, it's going to be a scaled score. So the kid's going to have a score between 8 and 12. Now, when we get to a lot of the social emotional questionnaires, they're reporting on T-scores. And T-scores average around 50. The average is 50, and normal would be 40 to 60. So on a T-score, when you see like a 70 or an 80, then we're getting really concerned. Or if we see something really low, like a 20 or a 30, then that's when you get worried on a T-score. That's why I tend to look for the percentile ranks, because that always makes sense to me. When you're looking at all these different types of scores, it can be confusing. And so I think it's better, like if you can find the percentile scores, that's going to be your easiest way of interpreting. Are there any questions on that, on this little mini quick statistics challenge? Actually, I would have asked you to bring a sample report with you, but I didn't have a way of communicating with you. But if you take these slides and go back and compare what we're talking about today to a sample report, I think you'll be able to find most of the components that I've mentioned today. And if anyone has questions later, you're very welcome to get in touch with me. Okay, after the results section, now most of the psychs are going to put their tables in the text. It gets very jargony, very statisticky. We at Linden, we put our tables at the end, so it just keeps the reading smoother. But after that, then they should have a summary. And the summary should be going back to the referral question. What were we trying to answer? And you'd be like, okay, now we have all these numbers. What does it mean? And for the psych, this is the most challenging and the most important part. And that's why they need a lot of training to be able to interpret, what does this mean? And after you do this for a while, like those scores all start to like make pictures in your mind, and you start to get really good at like, oh, okay, now I see it. And for me, like I'll do my testing and I sit there with all the numbers, and at first I'm like, this doesn't make any sense at all. And then it comes together. So that's what they should be doing in the summary. Addressing the test areas that they looked at. Did they look at cognitive, academic, emotional? Reporting not the scores. They shouldn't be reporting the scores, just what does it mean? A good report will be integrating the students' strengths and resources, as well as just their deficits. A lot of psychologists get hung up on just looking at the deficits, but really great psychs are the ones that are tying in what's great about that child, what strengths and resources they're bringing to the table. And finally, the part that teachers and you guys are most excited about is the recommendations. These should be clearly based on that summary. Sometimes you'll read a report and you see the recommendation, you're like, wait, where did they get that from? I don't even know, that just came out of nowhere. So I should ideally be able to look back and find, or there should be a clear line between the recommendation and the results. And ideally, you're going to be able to have a team meeting to discuss the recommendations. I think somebody had the question about applicability of the test results. That's where this is going to come in. Linden assessments will have often 2 pages of recommendations. We know that you guys can't implement all of those recommendations. If there's 15, maybe you can implement 5 of them. You sit down as a team and say, okay, they're asking for this, 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 and this. We can only do 3 of them. Great, let's implement the ones that we can. Let's do this one for now, and then if that's not working, we can try these others later. What I really like to do is sit down with the student when they're old enough and say, okay, the psychologist has recommended these things. Which ones would you like to try? Which ones sound nicest to you or coolest, or like they're going to be most effective or least embarrassing? Yeah. Okay. Wrapping up. The 4 essential considerations that I really would like, if there's anything that you guys take home with you today, I would like it to be this. This is what I think is most important when you're interpreting a report for international school students. Please just remember, like with our little standardization sample exercise we just did, of the limitations of these measures in international populations. We're going to use that information the best we can because we don't have any other tools, but just keep in mind, these are not perfect measures, and that score is not a perfect score. It's just a snapshot with a bad camera of a kid at one moment in time. That's why we're going to take in mind their multilingualism, their history, what they say about themselves, what their mom says, their dad says, their teacher says, and put it together. Keep in mind the cultural differences. How long has the student been in this setting? Are we talking about a Japanese student who's recently moved to Brazil? We can't discount that. That should be woven into the report somehow. And if it's not, then it's going to be your job to weave it in yourself. Also, what I find missing a lot is people not considering in the reports gaps due to moving. There was a student and moved from Kentucky to a super rigorous IB school in Hong Kong. They had huge gaps in their math. It wasn't a math disability. It was just a gap due to moving around. And it's not something that the psychologist had been able to take into account because that was 2 moves ago or something like that. As these kids move, information goes missing. So yeah, in our populations, because our tests aren't perfect, it's either the psychologist's job or your job to take special consideration about these 4 aspects. Yeah, and I'm going to also leave you with 6 warning signs. You might want to take a picture of this slide. This is the thing I think will probably be one of the most useful things for you. Warning signs that a report might not be providing the best information. If a test is outdated, you saw in the test that I listed, it was the WISC-5 and it was the Woodcock-Johnson 3 or 4, I can't remember, but if the psychologist is using an old test, not the most recent version, then it is not a legitimate, valid, or accurate measure of the child's performance. You find this a lot in the international setting because these tests are super duper duper expensive. And so a lot of times a local psychologist will be just using an old measure. At the same time, not every country has the WISC-5. Some of them, like the German version, they're still using a WISC-4 in German because they haven't done a new standardization, a new norming yet. So that's something for you to keep in mind when you're reading a report. Have they used the most recent versions of the instrument? Secondly, something that happens a lot is a local psychologist will just use, let's say, again, the German version of their test and just read it to the student in English. That test isn't also not valid. That hasn't been a proven test item if you're just translating it by yourself on the fly. So those measures need to be interpreted with extreme caution. Another thing you see a lot that's a red flag is, of course, psychs are humans and they're copy pasting their reports. It happens, it's normal. But if you're reading a report about Leanne, and on page 7, we start talking about Lucy, that report has lost all credibility because is this Lucy's report or Leanne's report, or which parts of that data were correct or which were not? That's a really important thing that you need to keep an eye out for. Also, you'll see in the body of a text, in the body of the report, they'll say, oh, IQ score was 76. But then you look in the table and it says 96. Wait, which one is it? That's a really important difference. And that means that there is carelessness happening in the report. You're going to want to follow up with the psychologist and take that whole report with a big salt shaker. If you get a report and it seems like a computer wrote it or just somebody pushed a button, that's also not legitimate. These, especially with international school kids, these scores have to be interpreted. It cannot just be a computer printout. Another thing happens frequently, you'll get a report that's just maybe just a paragraph and no test scores. That's not a good sign. You need to be able to also reflect back where the information came from. And my last warning sign is if the psychologist has not taken into account the child's strengths or resources, because that's what makes them able to overcome all the challenges that they have. If you get a less than fabulous report, you can reach out to the psychologist to ask questions, but be honest with the parents about the quality. The IB will not accept reports that are not using the right kinds of instruments or where the scores are not reported properly. So that's a huge waste of time, energy, and cost for the families if it's not done correctly. So ideally, you have good referral sources at the beginning, but if you do get a report that's not good enough, you can also reach out to us to ask questions about how we could help. It's important to know, like, if you get if a student's been tested with a WISC, for example, I can't do it again in 6 months because it's invalidated. But I have other cognitive measures I can use. So we could do a new assessment with new measures. It can happen, but you can't just do the same assessment over. It makes it illegitimate or irrelevant, invalid. Finally, my 6 steps for reading an EdPsych report. I start, number 1, I check the date of the evaluation. It shouldn't be more than 3 years old. Number 2, I look for the referral question. What were we trying to find out? Number 3, I look at the instruments used and see if the instruments were the correct versions, if they're up to date. Then I flip to page 47 and I read the summary. Then I go back and read the results or the report, looking for things that I'm specifically interested in. And I compare the scores to the text and make sure that everything is aligned. And then the psychologist should always have their contact information in the footer of the report, and they should be happy to help you if you have any remaining questions. So don't be shy to do that. I mean, especially not with Linden reports, but the others too. It's their ethical professional practice to respond to questions. That's why their names and contact are in the reports. So I had written down questions about accommodations. Let's see, accommodations should be, I didn't hit that. Accommodations should always be in the recommendations. The IB and the others exam boards have very specific guidelines for, like, depending on what the standard score is, how much extended time the student can get. So we have those always printed out or hanging next to our computers. to follow, depending on the standard score, how much time extensions they get. Those are very specific. Linden reports always get through the IB. The SAT exam boards have different requirements. They're a little bit trickier to deal with sometimes. And then there's also a list from the IB about other exam accommodations, and we have to follow those when we're talking about IB. Other than that, our psychologists may make all sorts of recommendations. And if you're not talking about standardized final exams, but just things that a teacher can do, you can make all sorts of accommodations. It's really from school to school and teacher to teacher what kinds of accommodations they feel comfortable making. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I think, and the question about how to talk to kids, that we have a blog post on the Linden page about how to talk to kids, but there's a wonderful book by a woman named Liz Alcroft. Now I'm getting confused, but it's called The Brain Building Book. And it's this sweet little kind of picture workbook. There's one for primary school age children, and there's one for secondary age children. And you can sit down with an EdPsych report and then talk through it using the pictures with the children about like the superhighways in their brains and like roadblocks and stuff like that. It's really, really cool. But there is a blog post on our webpage that talks about how to talk to kids. And there's also one how to talk to parents about EdPsych reports. So you can look for that, because I know that can be tricky sometimes recommending an assessment. Yeah, well, that's it for me.
Christina, thank you so much. That's very, very helpful and very important for us to help our members, the members of Inclusive Education Group, the audience for ECIS. I want to ask a question. When we have, let's say we have, I'm giving you an example, Japanese student moving to Frankfurt, yeah? So the English is not yet very strong as a language, although the instruction of, is done in English. How would you approach a situation if there's a need to assess the student? In which language would you do, and would you do a multi-language? How would you approach this again? Thank you.
Yeah, super duper important question. And I should have addressed that specifically. We typically would like a child to have at least 3 years of being in an English language setting before doing an assessment. And that's not always possible. That's our ideal, but it's not always possible. And so what we'll do, we do 2 types of reports. We do on-site, where we fly to schools and we'll work with children there in their school environment, but we also do remote assessments. If we're doing a remote assessment with a child who we think has doesn't have enough English, we'll always interview the child and an ESL teacher first and say, what do you think they'll be able to do, and make sure that we're really able to do an assessment online. And then with every student who's an English language learner with less than 5 years, probably, we would always do an English language screener at the very beginning that's comparing, we use the PVAT, which compares an English language learner to an English language learner. So depending on how many years of English language exposure they have, we're comparing them to that and using that to inform our interpretations. Then we're always going to, for a student like the one you said, if we go ahead with the evaluation, we will be placing much less emphasis on any of the verbal scales. We're going to be looking a lot more at the nonverbal scales, and then even calculating a nonverbal IQ to be as fair as possible. We're always trying to speak to the student's highest potential. And if we weave the verbal scores into the total IQ, then we're bringing the whole score down, and it's not a legitimate reflection of the child's abilities. If we can, Japanese, unfortunately, we cannot at this point yet. Growth mindset, any day it's going to be better. We don't have a Japanese speaking psychologist on the team yet. But if you'd been talking about French, Spanish, German, we would run a bilingual assessment. And 5th answer to your question is we have some measures that we can run small components, like we can do a memory test in 60 different languages. We would then pull a different Linden specialist or maybe an interpreter or an educator in to run that with us. Or we'd have an interpreter or another Linden specialist do the developmental background survey interviews with the family to get as rich of information as possible. But for a student like that, it might be best for us to be on site in person.
Thank you, Christina. That was very, very helpful. And that's a nice segue to our next webinar. We hope to see you all there on the 2nd of May, which is, I think you'll go deeper on the cultural factor, yeah,
Yes.
and the kind of culture, humility, I think, and competence. So we want to thank you so much. We can find the services on the Linden website, correct?
Yes.
If the schools want to contact you. And I know you also do crisis management. I have to say that, yeah, you also, you not only psychological assessments, but also workshops and crisis management as well.
Yes, we do. We do. Yes, we have
Fantastic.
a crisis management services, some pro bono ones for schools that are really an immediate crisis, and then others that are more long-term.
Very important. We have a pro bono factor, a pro bono service for
Yes,
students in emergency.
correct.
Fantastic.
Mhm.
That's wonderful. So if we don't have other questions from our audience,
We have one from
we
Karine.
have questions. We have 3 more questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Karine wanted to ask if IQ should always be included in the report. And for the most part, I would say yes. It's an ed psych report should have IQ. That's usually kind of just used as the benchmark measuring stick. There will always be exceptions, but for the most part, yes, there should be. Again, depending on the referral question, but I would say 95% of the time, at least it should.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christina. Well, we hope everyone a very restful weekend, and we hope to see you on the 2nd of May.
See you then.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for coming.